Good evening. My name is Lori Zabata, and I'm a proud JWU alumna and the Director of Alumni Relations at Johnson & Wales University. Thank you for joining us for today's session, Sip with JWU, Bourbon, a Classic American Spirit. We're excited to bring this program to you virtually so we can learn about bourbon's history, flavor profile, and how to enjoy it whether on its own or in a delicious cocktail. Before we get started, I'd like to review a few housekeeping items. This session is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. With the exception of the presenters, all participants have been muted. Please leave your cameras turned off until the tasting portion of the presentation. When directed, if you'd like to turn your camera on, please do so. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the chat button on the bottom of your screen. We will refer to this section to take questions at the conclusion of the presentation. Set your view to speaker view in the top right corner of your screen. This will be the best way to see our presenter. We suggest selecting Show Small Active Speaker Video as the view. Since we can't be together in person for this program, please keep it social. Feel free to share pictures of your at-home setup, a selfie, or photo of who you're enjoying the session with. Be sure to tag at JWU Alumni in your posts on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. I'd like to thank the Alumni Relations team for their help behind the scenes for today's session, especially Lauren Anderson, Manager of Alumni Relations, for her work to bring this program to us. Thanks, Lauren. I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Linda Pettine, a proud JWU graduate and Associate Professor in the College of Food Innovation and Technology at the Providence campus. A graduate of North Adams State College and Johnson & Wales University, Linda spent 17 years in the hospitality industry prior to shifting her career to education. Most of her industry experience focused in the front of the house of restaurants in the areas of fine dining and beverage operations. There, she developed a passion for hospitality and guest satisfaction. She also worked for a wholesale beverage distributor, representing a diverse portfolio of wine and spirits. Pettine's past work experience prepared her for her current position at JWU and her focus on beverage education. She strives to provide student-centered learning in a nurturing environment. With high expectations and clearly defined learning objectives, she works to inspire future beverage professionals. Pettine is a member of the Society of Wine Educators, United States Bartenders Guild, and Rhode Island Sommelier Society. She is a certified wine educator, certified spirits educator, and earned the Wine Spirits Education Trust Level 3 Advanced Certification. She's also a certified cognac educator, certified Bordeaux tutor, certified hospitality educator, certified spirits specialist, and United States Bartender Guild spirits professional. We're so grateful to have her and her level of beverage knowledge at JWU and with us this evening. Please join me in welcoming Associate Professor Linda Pettine.
Hi, everybody, and thank you, Lori, for that very kind introduction. It sounds like I'm certifiable, I think. But anyways, welcome to the Cuisinart Center of Culinary Arts and my favorite conversation, which is bourbon. Bourbon makes it better. I'm in one of my favorite classrooms, which is the mixology lab here at the Providence campus. It's kind of my home away from home. And I'm really looking forward to today's session. We have some fun things lined up for you. We're going to talk a little bit about the, as Lori introduced, the history of bourbon. We're going to do some bourbon tasting, the difference between what I'll call a wheated bourbon versus a rye bourbon. And then we'll have some fun crafting some pretty classic cocktails. So I'm going to take just a moment and pull up my PowerPoint. And we'll get started. Perfect time of the year with the leaves changing and the cold weather and a little nip in the air to kind of transition to those brown spirits, those warm spirits that just, are designed for sipping or, enjoying with friends and family. So we are going to talk a little bit about the history of bourbon. Let me just advance my screen here. So basically, bourbon is a whiskey, but not all whiskeys can be bourbon. And we're going to talk a little bit about straight bourbon or straight bourbon whiskey. So bourbon, by the US standards of identity, has to be produced from no less than 51% corn as part of the grain recipe or mash bill. It can only be produced in the United States. That is, thank you, Jimmy Carter, that pretty much established the geographic protection of bourbon here in this country. It can be produced anywhere in the US, but the majority of bourbon actually comes from the state of Kentucky. A straight bourbon whiskey has to be aged for a minimum of 2 years in a brand new charred American oak barrel. So that barrel can only be used one time. There can be no additives post distillation, so nothing except for water can be added back into bourbon once it's been distilled. If it's aged for 4 years or longer, then the age statement is optional on a bourbon bottle. Regular whiskeys have to be distilled to less than 190 proof, but as an American straight whiskey, the distillation can be no more than 80% or 160 proof. And most bourbons are distilled in that range between, say, 130 and 160 proof. It has to be reduced to less than 62.5% or 125 proof when it's placed in the barrel before aging takes place. It is unblended, and there can be no neutral spirits or unaged whiskeys blended in. And as I mentioned, a straight whiskey has to be aged for a minimum of 2 years, and absolutely no coloring or additives are allowed. So I like to think of bourbon as really, the American spirit, but it wasn't necessarily the first type of whiskey that was consumed in this country. We had many German and Irish immigrants that settled into what was then Western Pennsylvania, and they would have brought with them their whiskey making skills and their recipes. And many of the whiskeys that were first consumed were rye whiskeys, where there was an abundance of rye that was grown in the Pennsylvania regions, and it made sense to utilize excess crops to be able to either produce beer and then distill it into whiskeys. But in the late 1700s, the U.S. government gave an incentive to sort of migrate further west. And many of these farmers were incentivized to move into what is currently the state of Kentucky. And it was, initiative for them to plant corn. So corn became a grain that was readily available. And as a result, whiskey making in that region kind of reflected the grains that were most plentiful. So as I mentioned, bourbon can be produced in any state here in the US, but 95% of what is produced is made in Kentucky. And you might say, well, why Kentucky? Well, Kentucky has basically all the ingredients necessary. There's an abundance of limestone water. Kentucky basically sits on a limestone shelf, and as a result, the water is naturally filtered with the limestone, and it's iron free. And this is a really key point here, because iron is no good for whiskey. It can actually turn the water black and give it somewhat of a metallic taste. As I mentioned, corn was plentiful with the incentive to farm and plant the corn or the maize. And the forests that were plentiful, providing the white oak to be able to raise or produce the barrels. So it just made sense that Kentucky became sort of the epicenter for the production of bourbon. So I'm going to chat just a little bit about the differences and try and bring in some history in the meantime. So if we're considering the difference between rye bourbons and wheated bourbon, I'm going to start with the rye-based bourbons. So you may be familiar with, and we recommended that if you're going to do the comparison, that you try a Jim Beam. And as it turns out, Jim Beam is turning 225 years old this year. We're talking about 7 generations of the Beam family that have been distilling. They were part of the German immigrants that came to this country in the 1740s. And the German name was actually Bohème, and Jacob Beam changed the name to, or anglicized the name to Beam. And he, moved his family to Kentucky and started producing whiskeys. His first whiskey was produced in 1795, and they've been distilling ever since. So Jim Beam is referred to as a low rye bourbon. And if you go back to what I said about the mash bill, or the grain recipe, has to be a minimum of 51% corn. Well, Beam uses a higher percentage, about 77% corn, which is in the range of what many bourbons are, usually around 70+%. But they use, the remaining grains are 13% rye and 10% of malted barley. Now, malted barley is common to the recipe because it has an enzyme that it contains that can convert starch to sugar. And that's really the magic button, because we need to have fermentable sugars that can be converted into alcohol. And then when we distill, we're actually separating and concentrating the alcohol by heating it up and then cooling it back down. So that would be the distillation process. So the 77% corn and 13% rye and 10% malted barley actually puts what I would call Beam, the white label, as a low rye bourbon. A high rye bourbon typically would have 20% rye in their mash bill recipe. So basically they're going to take these grains, they're going to mill them or crack the grains and create a grist, and then they put it into a mash tun where they're going to cook it. And basically this is where the conversion of starch to sugar takes place. Now, Beam as a sour mash, as many bourbons are, take what is known as backset. Backset is that leftover highly acidic residue that's left at the bottom of the beer still after the first distillation. So they take that acidic residue and they blend it in with the cooked grains. And that kind of balances out the pH, and the acidity will balance the sweetness, especially from the maize. So once they've cooked the grains, they're going to add the yeast to start the fermentation, which is the creation of the alcohol. Now, Beam has a secret proprietary yeast strain that they have carried through from generation to generation. They talk about the distiller bringing it home, keeping it in his refrigerator, because, for any of the bakers that might be watching, the sourdough process. So this is that starter that gives them the consistency of the fermentation and kind of guarantees the flavor profiles that they're looking for. So Beam is a double distilled bourbon. When it comes off the still, it's usually in around the 130% range. And then they are going to dilute it with some demineralized water to bring it down to less than 125 proof. And then they put it in the brand new American charred oak barrels. And Beam uses what's known as a number 4 alligator char, which is, usually the barrels, once they've been raised or created, they put them over an open flame. And for a number 4, it might be about a minute or so that it's over the flame. And it actually creates that alligator char. Think of like a campfire once it's been put out, that char that you see left on the logs. And that's really the magic ingredient when it comes to aging bourbons. Now, bourbon has to be aged, a straight has to be aged for a minimum of 2 years, and beam double ages theirs. So they age for a minimum of 4 years, and then they bottle their spirit at 40% alcohol by volume or 80 proof. Now, what you should know about rye is rye in the mash bill, there's a saying that says rye is loud and proud. It really has this spicy character that it adds to the whiskey, a little bit of what they might call a rye bite. So just a little, FYI, when a spirit is distilled, when it comes off of the still, it does not matter what the base ingredient is that it was made from. All spirits are colorless, they are odorless, and they are dry. So if you look at, the bourbons that you have in front of you, I'm holding up my Maker's Mark, you can see they have this incredible golden amber hue to them. And all of that comes from time in the barrel, because these barrels, especially in Kentucky, are aged in these multiple story warehouses, and there's huge temperature fluctuations. So the barrels actually increase or expand and then decrease, and the new make whiskey is now going in and out of the barrel. And as a result, the barrel actually gives color to the whiskey over the period of aging. It concentrates the flavors because there's evaporation that takes place, and it flavors the whiskeys. There are, vanillins that are extracted through what's known as the red layer as it's going in and out of the barrel, and just all these beautiful flavors and aromatics are produced. So the barrel is really, a key component, and the length of time that they age and the conditions of the warehouses and the aging as well. Now, if we compare that to Maker's Mark is a wheated bourbon. And Bill Samuels is, really responsible for sort of a revelation in the bourbon world, because he too, as a farmer, started experimenting with different grains. He actually started to bake bread to compare the differences. And he was the first to sort of transition from using, instead of rye, he uses red winter wheat. So his mash bill, or his recipe, consists of 70% corn. He has 16% of the red winter wheat and 14% of the malted barley. Again, the barley has those enzymes. And that winter wheat really imparts sort of this front of the palate sweetness that Maker's is really noted for. They have a limestone filtered lake on their property. They source their winter wheat from a single farm, and they have the secret proprietary yeast strain that they rely on as well. Here we see they use a number 3 charred American oak barrel, brand new barrel. They char it for about 30 minutes, not quite the intensity of the alligator char that Beam uses, but they tend to age their whiskey for a longer period of time. So the marketing will tell you that they choose the whiskeys when they're ready. But on average, Maker's is between 6 and 7 years in a barrel. Now, the difference here is Maker's does do a barrel rotation. So they're actually rotating barrels that might be up on the 8th or 9th level or floor of the warehouse, the rick house where they're aging. And they'll rotate them down to the lower levels where it doesn't age as quickly or as aggressively. And Maker's bottles their bourbon at 45% or 90 proof. So it has a little higher bottle proof than the Jim Beam. And they actually changed that a few years back and dropped the ABV, but there was quite an uproar from many of their regular consumers. So they have gone back to the 45 alcohol by volume. So that's a little bit of the history about the background of whiskey or bourbon making, how it, kind of settled into Kentucky. And with that, I think it's probably time to taste. So if you haven't already, you should pour out a little portion of, if you're doing the comparison, your rye whiskey and your wheated whiskey. And you really only need about 1/4 of an ounce or 1/2 an ounce to be able to do the assessment. And then if you're crafting, we can use the remainder to be able to make some cocktails. So I always say the very first thing, first of all, alcohol dehydrates you. So if you haven't already, I suggest you take a big drink of water because that will certainly help. And then I'm going to start with the Jim Beam, with the rye or low rye bourbon. So before I even start, I'm just going to use this as a little mouthwash to remove any lingering aromas or flavors on my palate. So without even thinking about it, I'm just going to swish it around. And now my palate's really awake and ready to go. So you see, if you have the tasting sheets, we follow a systematic approach to tasting, and this is what we teach to our students as well. And that is, you should look at the appearance or assess the appearance of the spirit. Then you go to the nose, then the palate, and then we'll move on to talk about the finish or the conclusion as well. So when I look at my spirit, I have a beautiful chimney glass, which is really ideal for assessing spirits. And you have to remember, this is, for people that might be accustomed to tasting wine, tasting spirits, we're talking about 80 proof or 40%. So you can't really stick your nose in there and inhale, really aggressively, because you're going to anesthetize your olfactors, or you're going to kind of get that alcohol burn. So first I'm going to go to the appearance, and I like to look on a 45-degree angle, and I'm just going to gently roll the whiskey around in the glass. Because by doing that, I can see how it hugs the side of the glass. And depending upon how quickly or slowly those, what they call legs or arches, kind of drip down the side, that can be a clue as to whether or not we're talking about higher alcohol or potentially sugar sweetness in the glass. And we know there's no sugar added back into this. All the sweetness will come from time in the barrel. So I would describe this as clear. It's actually rather bright. And my Jim Beam has sort of that golden, almost a little reddish amber hue to it. On the nose, I'm going to bring it up to my nose, but I'm not going to put my nose all the way in there. As soon as I can start to smell anything, I'm going to stop. And I keep my mouth slightly open when I inhale. The alcohol is going to raise the aromatics up out of the glass. So I'm going to breathe in, take a couple of sniffs. This is just a beautiful, beautiful bourbon. It's clean, there's no faults, no flaws to it, and it's got sort of a medium pronounced intensity on the nose. And I get this lovely sweetness from time in the barrel. To me, it has that, that little gentle vanilla, maybe almost like a creme anglaise, something creamy or caramelized. Some people might think a little bit of that, I don't know if you've ever made a cornbread batter, but a little bit of that corn sweetness. And a little bit of something that makes me think spice, and that's the rye talking to me. But you also get the barrel. There's just that hint of char or smoke and the toasty oak coming across on the barrel as well. I'm going to have you take a little sip and actually chew it up. You want it to touch every single part of your palate. On the top of your tongue, under your tongue, and while it's in your mouth, breathe in and out your nose, because that's going to bring the aromatics up through your olfactory and help you to actually taste. So chew it up. Once you spit it out, you want to, again, breathe in through your mouth and out through your nose, because that's going to cool back the alcohol burn and give you more of the flavor characteristics. So on the palate, this has beautiful barrel sweetness that comes across. That's kind of the initial attack for me. I'm getting that vanilla. I get almost like, I don't know if anybody's had like a Werther's caramel, but that little, you know, caramel creaminess as well. And then I'm getting that little bit of that char or the oak that comes across. And to me, the finish is that little rye bite, that little bit of spice, almost like a hint of black pepper or cinnamon red hots. I don't, again, I sound like a candy fiend, but I think, you know, that's where my mind goes. That's my data to be able to, you know, assess the spirits. It's got really a nice, there's that, what they call the bourbon love. You kind of get that warmth coming up from your solar plexus and working its way, kind of warming you up a little bit. And to me, that's a good thing, because the warmth from the bourbon kind of balances the length of the flavor that's coming, because it's morphing through. I love the vanilla, a little bit of that, you know, grainy or grassiness is coming across, and then the, you know, the rye bite, that spiciness on the palate as well. It's got some nice complexity. This is a good bourbon. This is the #1 selling bourbon in the US for a reason. So that's our Jim Beam, and I think now we could shift to the Maker's Mark for those of you that have the you know, the wheated bourbon to be able to do the comparison. So this too is nice and bright, but to me it has a deeper amber hue to it. And that could be from the additional time in the barrel. Again, on average, 6 years for Makers. On the nose, this too is nice and clean. It doesn't seem, it seems a little subtle in the glass compared to the Jim Beam. The Beam to me had sort of that big burst of vanilla initially. This too has that vanilla, kind of the caramel, makes me think almost like a caramel apple, because I'm picking up a little bit of fruit. Certainly that, you know, the liquid cornbread or that sweetness from the corn. And then the influence of the barrel, that oak, again, a little bit of the toasty char as well. Now you might think I'm a little crazy, but if you take your fingers and just dip it into your Maker's Mark, and then take it and rub it in your hands, and then smell your hands, it's amazing to me how the wood just kind of pops right out. You pick up aromatics, providing you haven't washed your hands 10 million times and they smell like soap, but a little bit of that barrel sometimes comes through. I know we look a little crazy, but sometimes you can pick up something that you didn't first detect when you go to the nose. So I think it's time to taste the Makers as well. So we're going to do the same thing. Actually chew it up, inhale in and out through your nose, then swallow or spit, and then do that in through your mouth, out through your nose, so that the heat from the alcohol kind of cools. Get that beautiful solar plex warmth coming through. That's the alcohol, little higher in strength. This is 45% or 90 proof. But boy, is that wheat present in that beautiful sort of sweet attack on the front of the palate. Again, I think vanilla is really rather pronounced. Hint of caramel, maybe butterscotch, kind of wafting through. A little bit of, the oak, and the finish on this to me is sweet as well, where the Jim Beam to me had almost that peppery or cinnamon spice, bite at the end. This just kind of wafts its way through the barrel sweetness that is really rather lovely. Love the warmth. This is really kind of starting deep in the solar plexus and working its way up. So that would be, the assessment, if you would. And, to finish talking about the quality, again, that the balance, length, and intensity and the complexity of the flavor really, to me, are an indication of the quality of the bourbon itself. If there was, just 1 out of 4 of those, then you might say it's acceptable. 2 out of 4 to me puts it in a good category. 3 out of 4 becomes very good, and 4 out of 4 really kind of knocks it out of the park as excellent bourbon. So hopefully you're able to kind of pick up on some of the differences here and appreciate the painstaking time that it takes to be able to produce these whiskeys. They can't, sell them or put them in bottle for at least 2 years, but we're talking about double aging with Jim Beam for 4 and makers for 6. And the thing you have to remember about the barrel is there is what they call the angel's share, or the loss to evaporation. And, if you're aging your whiskey for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years, you can lose a lot of that through evaporation. And what that does is, depending upon the conditions and whether it's more water evaporating or more alcohol, it concentrates the flavors of the whiskey. It really works at extracting those flavors from interaction with the wood. The vanillins come out, the sweet barrel notes. You can pick up some tannin, sort of that dry, astringent feeling, but all the color. And the other thing that the barrel does is it helps to filter the whiskey and kind of soften what you might think of as that fiery heat when it first comes off of the still. So time in the barrel mellows the whiskey, it colors the whiskey, it flavors the whiskey, it concentrates the whiskey as well. And, bourbon is big business in this country, and bourbon sales are showing steady increases again. And it's the perfect time of year to be sitting back and sipping a little bourbon. So with that, I think we're going to transition right into the next section, which would be creating some cocktails with these whiskeys. So I have some pretty basic and classic cocktails that have minimum ingredients. So I think for, those home bars where you might not have everything fully stocked, this is an easy way to be able to create some pretty yummy cocktails. So we're going to start with a very classic bourbon sour. And if you look, there's 3 ingredients in this. We love this recipe. So depending upon what you have for your home equipment, I'm going to start with my glass mixer, and that's what I'm going to build my drink in. Now, when I'm crafting and creating cocktails, I like to remind you to put the least expensive ingredient into the glass first. So I'm going to put my simple syrup, and simple syrup is just a 1-to-1 ratio of granulated sugar and water. And, you know, behind the bar in a pinch, it's sugar and water, and the bartender might just do a very aggressive shake to actually clarify the simple syrup and not even have to heat it up to be able to dissolve the sugar. Now, some bars might use what they call a rich simple syrup, where they increase the granulated sugar proportion to water. You could do a 1.5 to 1 ratio of sugar to water, or a 2 to 1 sugar to water to have a richer simple syrup as well. But if you think about putting the least expensive ingredients into the glass mixer first, if you ever got distracted and couldn't remember, it's not so expensive to dump simple syrup or lemon juice out, but it's pretty expensive to be dumping your bourbon out. So we're gonna start with, I have a jigger, and I'm gonna use my calibrated jigger, which has all the various measurements that I'm looking for on either side of the piece of equipment. If you don't have a jigger and you happen to have tablespoons, you could work with that as well, because a 1.5 tablespoons would equal 3/4 of an ounce. And then if you continue, you know that 2 tablespoons will equal 1 ounce, 3 tablespoons will equal 1.5 ounces, and 4 tablespoons will give you a 2-ounce measure. So I have my simple syrup all set up and ready to go, and I'm gonna measure out 1 ounce of simple syrup, and I'm gonna add that right into my glass mixer. And I fresh squeezed my lemon juice earlier. You should know that fresh squeezed lemon juice has a shelf life of about 24 hours. And if you're using lime juice, that's even less. It stays fresh for about 6 hours. So I squeezed some lemons, and then I strained it through a fine mesh strainer so that I don't have a lot of the pulp. You don't have to do that. Some people really enjoy the, you know, the little added flavor that might come through from the pulp itself. So I added 1 ounce of simple syrup. I'm adding 1 ounce of my fresh lemon juice, and I'm going to work with Jim Beam with this recipe. So I'm going to add 2 ounces of Jim Beam. And you notice I have not added my ice yet. Most bartenders, if they're free pouring especially, being able to see the volume in the glass is helpful. Now I'm going to ice down my glass mixer. And I'm using a Boston shaker, which is the glass mixer, and I have my metal tin. Some of you may have a cobbler shaker, which actually has the cover that acts as a strainer as well. And I'm gonna cap it, and I'm gonna tap it. And when I shake, I always invert the glass so it's on the top. And you never shake towards anybody, you always shake towards yourself. So I have the glass on the top, and I'm gonna keep it in place, and I'm gonna do a really aggressive, almost like a flick of the wrist back and forth, and I'm gonna count to 10 to get this nice and cold. Now, when I stop this, I have my Boston shaker straight up and down on one side, and there's a gap towards me, and then I have 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock. For me to break this seal, because this is stuck, I either go to 3 o'clock, I either go to 3 o'clock or 9 o'clock. So one little upward motion on the metal, never the glass, an upward motion takes this right out. And then I'm gonna use my Hawthorne strainer. Those of you that have a cobbler shaker, the strainer might be actually part of the top cover. And I'm just gonna strain this beautiful cocktail. If you are worried about the lemon pith, you could actually strain through the fine mesh strainer. And there we have my 3-ingredient drink. this, I think I'm going to garnish with a real wood. And there we have the Jim Beam Bourbon Sour. Cheers. I used a 1-to-1 ratio of simple syrup to lemon juice. If you find that it's a little too sweet, you can always dial back the simple syrup or increase the lemon juice to be able to balance out the cocktail for you. Now I'm going to move on to my next cocktail, which is actually a repeat of what we just made. However, I'm going to incorporate an egg white into the recipe. And an egg white is not going to flavor the drink, it's going to give it texture. It'll create a beautiful foaminess that really has that, you know, that silky feel on the palate. If anybody's a little, you know, vegan or doesn't like to use the egg white, you could substitute with aquafaba, which is the same liquid that chickpeas are canned in. So that liquid will create a foaminess in the cocktail as well. So I actually cracked some eggs earlier. I have it in here, and I'm just going to shake up my egg white a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and add about an ounce of the egg white. And then I'll continue with my lemon juice, which is 1 ounce of fresh lemon juice. And my simple syrup. And I'll use my Jim Beam. I added 1.5 ounces of the beam and no ice at this point. Again, I'm going to cap it, tap it, and I'm doing what's known as a dry shake because I really want to emulsify the egg white. I want it to, you know, the proteins to combine and actually create a little foam in my shaker. So I'm just shaking. Now I'm going to add the ice so that I can chill it down. And I'm going to shake with the ice. When you shake a drink, you're actually doing a couple of things. There's a dilution that takes place, about 25% dilution, and you're also bringing the temperature down. So here, a couple of ice shards that I really don't want in the glass, so I'm just gonna and for my sour, I'm going to put a couple of drops of Angostura bitters on the top. I am a huge fan of bitters, and I just think this brings a little something to the cocktail as well. So a couple of drops of the Angostura, that's certainly optional. And I just swirl through, create a little design as well. Cheers. Love the aromatics. And again, the foam is just textural. The flavors pretty much are the same, but the bitters really kind of elevates the flavor. Oh, that's good. All right, continuing, we're going to try a little different technique, but a very similar recipe. And this is a whiskey smash. Let me advance this here. So here, I have a lemon that I cut in half, and then I quartered that. So I have half a lemon, and I'm just going to add about an ounce of water. I have some beautiful mint leaves that I'm going to add right in there. And now I'll go ahead and add my simple syrup. So here I'm going to start with, I'm sorry, I have the wrong recipe up, my apologies. I'm going to add 3/4 of an ounce of my simple syrup. And I'm going to use my muddler. So here, I want to extract the juice from the lemon, but I'll also get a little bit of the citrus oils from the lemon rind. I'm going to use makers for this particular one, and I'll go ahead and add my bourbon. Ice this down. Cap it. And for this particular drink, I'm going to actually serve it over ice. Saying goes, you should never use ice twice. So I'm going to shake it, and then I'm going to fine mesh strain this one as well. By doing the double strain, I keep those mint leaves or the broken mint and any of the pith from getting into the cocktail. And then to garnish this, I'm going to take some mint sprigs. Now, some bartenders will slap it, actually, between their hands, but I think the best thing is to kind of aromatize the glass. So I'm going to wake it up by adding the mint and then garnish with my fresh mint. So that's my whiskey smash. And quickly to finish up, the mint julep, pretty classic cocktail. This too, we're going to start with some fresh mint in the cup. Here I'm going to add my simple syrup. I'm going to add about a half an ounce of simple syrup. If you like it a little sweeter, you could certainly increase that. And then my bourbon, again, I'm going to use Maker's Mark. Quick little muddle. All I'm doing is bruising my mint. I don't want to pulverize it. I'm just opening up those veins. And then instead of regular ice, I'm using crushed ice. You could put it in a blender. That would certainly, give you the consistency. And I'm just going to give a little stir, kind of get all those flavors together. I have a silver cup. I'm seeing the outside get frosty cold. That's what I'm really looking for. And then I'm going to top this off with some more crushed ice, like a giant snow cone. Kentucky Derby in the spring. This year they had it in September. I don't know if anybody knows how many mint juleps are sold during the Kentucky Derby. Wondering if anyone might know. It's a great question. That's a good trivia question. Garnish with my sprig. This definitely needs a good straw. That's my mint julep. 120,000 mint juleps are sold during Kentucky Derby, which was held in September this year, and no crowd, so that number might have been down. Anyways, that takes me through the last part, being the crafting portion, and hopefully I can answer questions should anybody have any at this point.
Thank you, Linda. We will certainly take some questions from the chat. If anyone has questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and I will get to them in the order they arrive in. The first question that we have, Linda, is from Ronald, and he is wondering, how do you know if it's a wheat or rye bourbon since the bottles don't say?
They really don't tell you that. They're, the majority are ryes. Maker's Mark is a wheated bourbon, Weller is a wheated bourbon, and the Pappy line, so Pappy Van Winkle, which if you can afford that on a daily basis, I'd like to be sipping bourbon with you. But those are the ones that come to mind. The majority of bourbons use the rye, whether it's a a high rye or a low rye bourbon is part of the the recipe of the house.
Great, thank you.
Flavor should tell you as well. If you get that really beautiful sweetness, kind of that sweetness on the front attack, and then on the finish of the palate, that could very well be the wheat speaking to you.
Great. Well, thank you. The next question kind of goes into that. Caitlin would like to know what would be an example of a high rye bourbon.
So if it has more than 20% rye in the mash bill, so Wild Turkey, Old Forester, those tend to have a higher percentage of the rye. And again, many of the recipes are either secret or proprietary, but with the the websites and the education and transparency that so many brands have, it's usually pretty easy to research and find the whiskeys or the bourbons that have the higher rye.
Great. So Marissa has a question about the recipes, and Marissa, we will be sending all of these recipes in the follow-up email, and also this presentation recording will be sent in the email as well in case you missed anything. But definitely we will send those along so you can make them again at home at another time. So Michelle was wondering if you might know the age time for Jack Daniel's rye.
Not offhand. Jack Daniel's Tennessee Sour Mash is aged just over 2 years, but I'm not sure what the rye is in the barrel. I'd have to look that up. Anybody online? Anybody with me happen to know? There's a great website called the Master of Malt that can easily be Googled to pick up a lot of information as far as the specifics to brands as well.
Great.
Big fan of rye. Love rye.
That was my favorite one tonight too.
Good.
So Caroline is saying that what are your thoughts on using a good bourbon on mixed drinks, especially with simple syrup? Is it considered a waste?
I don't think any bourbon is a waste. So, and it really depends. I mean, on a really hot summer day, I'm not sure I want to be sipping a bourbon neat. Again, that warmth that comes across, my face will get red flushed, and my whole body temperature would change. But chill it down and add some fresh citrus and maybe some fruit muddled into it, and that's a lovely summertime cocktail. The mint julep, that's refreshing. So I don't think it's a waste of bourbon, but I'm not sure I'm gonna, I might choose specific bourbons to craft cocktails with and other bourbons to sip either with a, you know, a single ice cube or neat by themselves.
Great. Craig would like to know, have you ever tasted Bella Mead Reserved Bourbon from Nelson Green Briar Distillery in Nashville?
I think I'm going to have to make a special trip. First of all, I've never been to Nashville, but that's on my bucket list for my, I won't tell you what birthday next year, and my daughter's coming with me. So you'll have to, I'll look at the chat, so I'll get the name of that. Kentucky's the only state that can put the name for the Kentucky Straight Bourbon on the labels. But bourbon is produced here in Rhode Island. We have a great distiller, you know, Sons of Liberty, and Mike Rapucci's doing some beautiful whiskeys. So yeah, it's exciting what's going on with the craft distillation around the country. Lots to pay attention to.
Great. All right, so I don't see any other questions, but I have one question that I would like to ask. What are your thoughts on using a flavored bourbon such as maple, apple, those kinds of flavors in a cocktail versus sipping it neat?
Well, I think depending upon the flavor and what the cocktail is, it could actually intensify, you know, the flavor profile. I just know I'm not going to spend the money on flavored bourbon. I like to do some infusions on my own. So in the classroom, we've worked with, you know, like bacon flavored or fat washing, or, you know, you can certainly macerate, you know, fruits or spices into your bourbon yourself, especially, you know, for home use. And I think that's the route that I would go. I like to, you know, kind of intensify the flavor. And if the flavored whiskey does that, kudos.
Great.
I'm a pretty simple
Professor
girl, though. I like the straight bourbons.
Yeah, the straight. Professor DiMartino actually did a little research and said that Jack Daniel's Rye is aged 4 years minimum, just like their classic Tennessee whiskey. So that is the answer to that question.
Thanks. Appreciate it, Mr. D.
So those are all the questions that we have. I want to say thank you to Linda, and I'll invite Lori to come back on to wrap us up.
Okay, let me just scoot out of here.
No need to scoot. Thank you, Professor Pettine, for leading us on tonight's tasting experience with bourbon. It was such an informative and interesting discussion about the distinct differences between wheated and rye varieties and how to build bourbon-based cocktails. We're grateful that you shared your time with us this evening and appreciate your insight on this spirit. Your passion for beverage education is so appreciated. We'd also like to thank all of our alumni attendees for joining us. Beverage appreciation and innovation is just one of the many things our students learn about in JWU's new College of Food Innovation and Technology, or CFIT. CFIT is a landmark interdisciplinary approach to education, meaning we work across areas of expertise to begin developing solutions, practices, and food innovations that make a difference in everyday lives. You can help support tomorrow's food and beverage leaders today with a donation directed to the College of Food Innovation and Technology. If you're in a position to give back, your gift will be put to use immediately as we embark on a new era at JWU. We've shared a donation link in the chat window. On behalf of our students, I thank you for your generosity. We sincerely hope that you enjoyed this evening's session, Sip with JWU Bourbon, a classic American spirit, part of the JWU for You family of programming. Through JWU for You, alumni can engage in informative and interesting discussions related to professional development, social, and avid interest topics. Join us next month when we will celebrate Oktoberfest with Professor Alistair Williams from our Charlotte campus. He will lead a discussion and tasting on craft beer. For more details and the full listing of upcoming events, please visit our events calendar at alumni.jwu.edu. We appreciate your attendance and wish you a very wonderful night.